While climate upheavals concern all foresters, some of them are even starting to reconsider the very basis of the Landes Forest itself. Jacques Hazera, owner of 200 hectares of forest, is one of them. Concerned by the losses caused by windstorms, Jacques Hazera has considered every alternative strategy. One alone has retained his attention: pro-silva silviculture, based on forest management that respects natural processes of forest growth and regeneration. But natural forest means several varieties of trees in the same plot of land, a principle that goes against the purpose of the Landes Forest, founded on the monoculture of maritime pines.
Here I'm pruning a nice oak tree. It's on a plot of my land which contains a healthy mix of varieties. We have the oak here, but a little further on there are pines and a few ash, a relatively large blend of varieties. Broadleafs have a very important influence on how a forest functions. For instance, in a forest of maritime pines, even just a few broadleafs will help enrich the soil a bit. In other words, broadleafs develop when the soil is a little more fertile than next door. And then once they're there, their presence improves the quality of the soil. So having them improves the conditions for growing maritime pines. Let's bear in mind that in this region, the maritime pine is the largest variety for almost every tree farmer, and that's why a very powerful commercial and industrial sector exists.
Polyculture opens up new perspectives, but it also represents a radical rupture with the forestry model that has been in operation for decades. To change the forest, you must first change the people. And in the Landes, habits die hard. But a parasite could possibly change everything. With the 21st century, a phenomenon already well known to lumberjacks has exploded to the point of decimating entire ecosystems: biological invasions. Entomologist Hervé Jactel has been closely studying the destructive insects that have invaded the Landes.
Most of the world's forests are currently experiencing a massive increase in public health risks, and the Landes Forest is no exception. This is linked to two major phenomena. First, climate change, and second, biological invasions. Climate change means a rise in temperatures that favor insects because they make more generations per population, so greater proliferation, which means more damage to trees. Biological invasions are all the insects that are introduced during commercial exchanges, containers that arrive in ports and airports. The insects emerge from these introductory zones and head to the forest, where they develop epidemics because they aren't regulated by their natural enemies.
Heading up the list of the pine forest's enemies is a parasite well known to tree farmers: the pine Precessionary caterpillar. The Landes Forest is the ideal environment for this fearsome herbivore. The maritime pine is perfect, as conifers are the habitat of choice for these voracious insects. They spin their cocoons in the branches and feed on its needles. Colonies of pine Precessionaries weaken the trees they infest by devouring their leaves each day. Even if the tree doesn't die, it's weakened by the attack. It develops poorly and becomes an easy prey for other pests. The fight against Precessionary caterpillars is urgent and not an easy one, especially in a forest as vast as the Landes. But rather than reflect upon treatment with insecticides, scientists are looking at the defenses developed by the ecosystem itself. Research on pine forests throughout the world have led to a surprising observation. Damage caused by precessionary caterpillars is much greater in forests planted exclusively of pines than in forests where several varieties of tree grow. Jacques decided to look into the predators of this destructive pest.
I'm installing a clutch of precessionary pine eggs that came from a lab here onto a branch of maritime pine.
Comparing different ecosystems will help determine which ones the precessionary's enemies thrive best in.
The goal is to understand why there is more predation among blends of maritime pines and broadleaves, notably birch, than in pure pine populations.
The great tit is one of the rare birds that dare attack the nests of precessionary caterpillars with their fearsome, irritating hairs. Only the hoopoe is more effective. It digs up cocoons hidden in the soil, destroying nearly 70% of precessionary larvae. Unfortunately, these two types of birds have a hard time adapting to a forest comprised exclusively of maritime pines.
What we aim to do is put up a preventative biological fight, consisting of diversifying the varieties of forest trees to offer different habitats for the natural enemies that live in mixed forests and can thus naturally control any type of destructive insect that attacks the maritime pine, be it the precessionary pine, bark beetle, or other potentially invasive insect that could find its way into our forests.
Although the precessionary caterpillar makes foresters nervous, the threat of an even more voracious parasite looms over the Landes forest, the pine wilt nematode. This microscopic worm has already decimated entire forests in Japan. It penetrates the tree itself and dries it up by blocking the circulation of water. Today, it has arrived at the threshold of Europe. It travels in the abdomen of certain longhorn beetles, which are already here. One of them is the monocamus, or soya beetle.
Soyas are what we call insect vectors of the nematode. The nematode may be exotic from China, but the vector, the insect, has always been present in Europe. It's indigenous. The pine wilt nematode is currently only in Portugal, where it was introduced and discovered in 1999. It multiplies extremely fast, a generation every 5 days, and it can kill a tree within 3 weeks. It's very important for us to estimate the soya's movements, to know how quickly the nematode can spread. We determined the soya beetle has an extraordinary flight capacity, up to 40 kilometers per generation. That means the front can advance by 40 kilometers a year, which explains that it will gradually reach Spain and arrive in France sooner or later.
In Portugal, despite control measures, chemical treatments, and the establishment of safety zones, the nematode has spread throughout the entire country in 5 years. For the Landes, there is only one potential defense: boost the forest's resistance by diversifying it.
We now know that mixed forests with several varieties of tree have a lot more advantages than simply controlling pests. For example, they're often more productive, more resistant to drought. They're also home to greater biodiversity. They're often more inviting for people too. So there are many advantages to silviculture that isn't based on a monoculture, but that associates different tree varieties.
When the Landes forest was created, biodiversity wasn't on the agenda yet. And perhaps that is the forest's Achilles heel.
The coastal forests that were planted in the 19th century are monospecific, mainly with maritime pines and a relatively modest understory with a bit of heather, some ferns, and a few strawberry trees. But it lacks compartments of the ecosystem, so these forests are relatively more sensitive.
A more diverse forest has huge ecological advantages. But in the eyes of forest operators, the determinating factor of these more natural foresting practices remain the increase in profitability.
I practice a form of tree farming that's as close to nature as possible. What that means is I consider the ecosystem to be my real production tool. It isn't the tractors I take into the forest that are going to harm and damage it. If I manage to have ecosystems that are in their most natural state possible, that's where they'll be the most effective and productive. My concerns are economic. I aim to live off my forest. But to do so, I can't ignore the conditions of growth, the soil, the climate, the wildlife there, plant diversity. It's all one big whole. In the end, if all that is working well, my earnings are improved. My production goals are what is the highest, the most noble, the most profitable type of wood. Knowing that a tree you've known, that you've raised, cut and sold or used yourself, knowing that that tree has become timber and is now part of a house or a piece of furniture, a stairway or desk. Now, obviously, that's highly satisfying. There's an important emotional aspect, but that's not all. There's also the fact that when we use the wood for beams or rafters, the time it takes the tree to grow, say 80 years, well, that's 80 years of carbon gas trapped from the atmosphere and stored underfoot in the tree. Then if we make beams from it, that means another 100 or 200 or 300 years the carbon is stored and doesn't make it into the ozone layer. So it's an important contribution to the climate, to the evolution of our societies.
By letting nature do its job, Jacques Hazera has revived a type of forest that greatly resembles the original Landes forest. The one that covered a tiny part of the land long before man planted 1 million hectares of maritime pines.